15 years, in a world where a single nod from him could make an entire waterfront hold its breath. And Rafael Caruso had grown used to no one meeting his eyes. People looked down. People stepped aside. People paid on time. He ate dinner alone at 9 o'clock at table 4 in his own restaurant. Always the same dish. And for 4 years nobody had asked him if he was all right. Then, one cold November afternoon, in the lot behind the Federal Hill Fish Market, he saw 2 men standing too close to a young woman sitting on the loading steps. Beside her lay an old Neapolitan Mastiff, his slate gray coat silvered around his heavy jowls, and a rain-soaked piece of cardboard at her feet. Free to a good home. Please. That last word was written smaller than the rest, the way words come out when the hand holding the pen has been tired for a long time. The dog didn't bark. He didn't ask anyone for pity. He only rose slowly, his back legs trembling with the effort, and placed himself in the space between the woman and the 2 men. One of them laughed and took another step forward. Rafael put his hand on the car door. He thought he was only clearing 2 troublemakers out of his own neighborhood, a small thing, under 2 minutes' work. He was wrong, because when the old dog turned and looked at him, Rafael found in that stare the exact thing he had paid a great deal of money, over a great many years, never to have to remember again. If this story reached something in you, leave a like so we know. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it today, and subscribe if you'd like to stay with us for more stories like this one. The car door closed softly behind him, and Rafael Caruso stepped through the puddle without bothering to avoid it. He called no one to follow. His driver remained motionless behind the wheel, both hands still resting on it, because he'd worked for this family long enough to understand that when the boss opened his own door, the wisest thing to do was stay where you were. The rain had thinned into a fine drifting mist that clung to the shoulders of his wool coat. Rafael walked slowly. He never hurried. Hurrying was for men who had to fight for space, and he'd grown accustomed to watching space open before him on its own. The shorter man saw him first, faltered half a step, then did what frightened men so often did. He laughed louder. The tall man didn't laugh. He turned his head and measured the approaching stranger with the eyes of someone who'd been measured many times in his life, and in that instant Rafael knew this one was smarter than his friend, which was both good news and bad. The girl didn't look up. She remained seated on the loading dock steps, both hands clenched around the chain, her eyes fixed on the rain-slick asphalt, as though everything might pass over her if only she stayed quiet enough. The dog looked up. It remained exactly where it had chosen to stand, between her and the 2 men, its massive head slightly lowered, deep brow wrinkles furrowed, its heavy folded ears resting against his broad skull. It didn't growl. It only watched Rafael, and there was something in that gaze that waited for an answer without begging for one. "Bud Mahoney," Rafael said. He stopped 3 paces away, slipped one hand into his coat pocket, and spoke in the even voice of a man reading the daily specials from a board outside a restaurant. "Lenny Poag." The shorter man fell silent. The laughter went out on his face like a candle smothered beneath a hand. "You work for Harrogate Capital. 4th floor of the building at the corner of Westminster and Dorrance. The elevator on the right gets stuck. The man who signs your checks is Philip Tannehill." He paused, not to catch his breath, but to give each name enough time to fall and reach the bottom. "And your mother, Mr. Poag, lives on Atwell's Avenue, in the row house painted pale yellow, with the geraniums outside the 2nd floor window. She goes to Sunday morning mass at 7 o'clock. There was no threat in those words, not one. Rafael Caruso had never needed to threaten anyone, and that was precisely why people feared him. He'd simply shown the 2 men that someone had written down their lives in full, carefully and completely, then placed the record in a drawer. Lenny swallowed hard. He glanced at Bud, waiting to be told what to do, exactly like a man who'd spent his entire life waiting for someone else to make his decisions. Bud didn't look back. He kept his eyes on Rafael, and for several seconds, he calculated quickly. He counted the windows within 50 meters. He wondered whether anyone was sitting inside the black car parked across the lot. He measured the price of saying one more word. Then he lowered his shoulders slowly, with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to retreat without appearing to retreat. "We were only asking the price," Bud said. His voice was sweet, almost friendly, which made it all the more unpleasant. "The sign says free. In this country, people are still allowed to ask." "People are allowed to ask," Rafael replied. "They aren't allowed to stand that close." Mist settled across Bud's face. He wiped it away with one hand, then nodded as though he'd just heard a clause in a contract and accepted its terms. Fine. He tapped Lenny on the sleeve. Let's go. Lenny opened his mouth to say something, some last sentence meant to salvage a fragment of pride, but Bud was already pulling him away, and the words died in his throat before they were ever born. The two men had gone about 10 steps when Bud looked back. He didn't look at the girl. He looked at Raphael, and this time there was no sweetness left in his voice, only something flat and almost pitying. You're defending the wrong person. Raphael didn't answer. He stood still until the gray pickup truck rolled out of the lot, turned left, and disappeared behind the row of warehouses. Only then did he realize that throughout the entire exchange, he'd never once taken his eyes off the dog. Across the street, behind the fogged glass of the corner cafe, an older man still sat beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He wore a faded canvas coat, his silver hair cut neatly, and only a few minutes earlier he'd begun to rise from his chair, one hand already braced against the table, when he saw the two men standing too close to the girl. Then he saw the black car. Then he saw the man step out of it, and he sat back down slowly, like someone who'd just understood that this matter already belonged to someone else. But he didn't look at Raphael. For nearly a full minute afterward, his eyes remained fixed on the dog standing guard in front of the girl, on his scarred, heavy muzzle, on the way it shifted its weight onto its front legs to spare its hindquarters, on a stance no dog was born knowing, a stance someone had taught it long ago, in a place very far from here. His hand tightened around the coffee cup. Then, he placed a bill on the table, tucked it beneath the saucer, rose to his feet, and walked toward the door without saying a word to anyone. Raphael bent down and picked up the piece of cardboard. It had absorbed so much water that one corner had gone limp, and he had to support it with both hands to keep it from folding in half. The ink had bled around the first word, but the final 3 words were still legible, written much smaller than everything else and crowded along the lower edge, as though whoever had written them had run out of room, or strength, or both. He didn't ask about them right away. He propped the cardboard against the bottom step so the water could drain from it, then straightened and looked at the dog. What's his name? The girl looked up for the first time. Her face was thin, her light brown hair had been tied hastily at the back of her neck, and a dry white streak of salt marked the sleeve of her coat from some place where she had been sitting for a long time. Sarge, she said. The dog moved his good ear when he heard his name, but his eyes remained fixed on the exit of the parking lot, where the gray pickup truck had just disappeared. He wasn't ready to rest. He was still working. Good name, Raphael said. My brother named him. She spoke, then fell silent, as though she had already given away more than she intended. Raphael kept several paces between them and lowered himself into a crouch, slowly, without reaching out, without smiling too soon. He had learned to do it this way long before he ever realized he was learning. Are you really planning to give him away? The girl's face hardened. No. The answer came too quickly, and she heard it in her own voice, so she stopped, drew a breath, then began again, more slowly. I did write the sign, but I didn't mean it like that. She placed a hand on the back of the dog's neck, not to restrain him, but simply to touch him. I'm not abandoning him. I just don't have enough anymore to take proper care of him. Raphael didn't answer. Some words needed to be left alone for a little while. Sarge turned his head and looked at both of them, then began to lie down. He lowered himself the way an old dog did when he knew exactly where his body would betray him. His front legs folded first, carefully, testing the ground. Then his hindquarters descended little by little, trembling once halfway down, stopping, then lowering the rest of the way. The entire process took almost 10 seconds. He didn't whine. His breathing didn't grow heavier. He never once looked toward the place that hurt, as though the pain belonged to him alone and no one else needed to know about it. Raphael watched every second from beginning to end and felt something old and buried ache beneath his breastbone, in the place he had believed sealed shut for the past 4 years. He isn't sick, the girl said. He's just old. I know, Raphael replied. She looked at him longer after that, not because of the words, but because of the way he had said them, without pity, without comfort. Simply one person confirming a truth to another person who already knew it. He worked at the Narragansett Bay shipyard for 8 years, she said. He was a night watchdog for the supply yards. My brother was in charge of managing the yard security animals. When Sarge got too old to guard the gates, they retired him. And when a massive dog like him retires, nobody wants a 6-year-old, 150-pound giant. My brother brought him home. Sarge released a long breath through his nose and rested his chin on the wet asphalt. My brother said other people gave him up because he was old, but our family never had much to begin with, so there was nothing for us to give up. Raphael let those words remain where they were. He glanced at the faded canvas bag beside her, a bag filled only 1/3 of the way, and at the coat that was far too thin for November. When did you last eat? I'm fine. That isn't what I asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched long enough for them to hear water dripping from the warehouse roof into a metal barrel. The morning before yesterday, she said. Raphael showed no reaction. He had seen grown men lie about hunger while their stomachs lay hollow beneath their shirts, because admitting it meant allowing the world to come one step closer, and the world was already standing far too near. What about him? He asked. He ate. She answered quickly this time, and now the speed in her voice came from pride rather than defense. At the loading area, when they wash the floor after the afternoon shift, there are trays of fish scraps they set aside because they can't sell them. It isn't garbage. It's clean. I asked for some, and they gave it to me. I removed every bone before I fed him. His teeth aren't good anymore. Raphael looked down at her hands. Her nails were short, and the tips of her fingers were red and split from the cold and the salt water. He thought about someone picking bones from fish with fingers like those, sitting somewhere in the November wind, so her dog could eat the meat that remained. Then he thought about the fact that the same person hadn't eaten in 2 days. He said neither thing aloud. What's your name? June Briscoe. Raphael Caruso. She gave the faintest nod, and he saw his name enter her eyes and remain there, along with everything that name carried through this city. She didn't stand and run. She didn't become more agreeable either. She simply tightened her grip on the chain a little and stayed where she was, the way people stayed still after darkness had fallen and there was nowhere else left to go. Sarge opened his eyes, looked at Raphael once more, then closed them again. Darkness had begun to fall, and the cold was changing its nature, leaving behind the damp chill of a rainy afternoon and hardening into the dry, unforgiving cold of a November night along the coast. Raphael rose from his crouch and brushed his hands against the front of his coat. Where do you sleep? June looked toward the row of warehouses. There's an awning behind the delivery area. It blocks the wind. The night guard knows me. He doesn't make me leave. Is the night guard there all night? She said nothing. That was answer enough. Raphael looked at the dog lying with his chin against the wet asphalt. At the hindquarters, he had watched lower themselves one painful stage at a time 10 minutes earlier, and he knew exactly what those hips would feel like after a night on cold concrete. I have a place, he said. It isn't my home. It's above my restaurant on Federal Hill. There's an apartment that's been empty since summer. The kitchen works, the hot water works, and there's heat. June's head came up sharply, and her expression changed completely. It wasn't fear. It was something harder than fear. The look people acquired only after too many others had treated them kindly for reasons that weren't kind. I know who you are, she said. This whole city knows who you are. Then you also know I don't need anyone's permission to take whatever I want. Raphael didn't say it loudly or proudly. He said it as though he were reading a line from a tax return. But I'm asking. June didn't answer. Her hand tightened around the chain, then loosened again. Rosalie Ferrante lives downstairs, he continued. She's 71. She's cooked for the restaurant since my father was alive, and she's the only person in Providence who has ever dared throw a dish towel in my face. She sleeps directly beneath the staircase. The apartment door locks from the inside. You keep the key. No one goes up to that floor, including me. If you decide to leave at 3 o'clock in the morning, you leave, and no one asks why. Why? Raphael looked at Sarge. Because he stood up for you even though it hurt him, and you were still the first one to reach out and touch him. He paused. I once had a dog who knew how to do the same thing. He died in my arms when I was 19, and I haven't thought about him in 15 years. It was more than he had said to anyone in the past 4 years, and he didn't understand why he was saying it in a parking lot behind a fish market to a stranger. June lowered her eyes. Almost too softly to hear, she said. I don't take charity. Good, Raphael replied. I'm terrible at giving it. Silence settled between them, and then one corner of her mouth moved. Not enough to become a smile, only enough to show that somewhere inside her there was still room for one if circumstances ever allowed it. She bent forward, braced a hand against the step, and tried to stand. Raphael saw that it took her 2 attempts. He didn't offer his hand. He understood that for some people, being helped to their feet hurt more than standing on their own. Sarge rose before she did. He came up in the reverse order of the way he had lain down, front legs braced, hindquarters pushing, one trembling pause, then his body straightening. He looked at Raphael, then at June, then stepped into place beside her left leg, close enough to touch, occupying that exact position without shifting so much as an inch. "Just for tonight," June said. "Just for tonight," Raphael repeated. He handed her the piece of cardboard. She took it in both hands and held it against her chest for a moment, then folded it in half and folded it once more until the handwritten words were hidden inside and no one could see them anymore. She tried to put it into her canvas bag, but the bag was already full. So Raphael held out his hand, and she gave it to him. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. As he folded it small enough to fit, his thumb brushed across the inside surface of the cardboard, the side that had been facing the ground, and that no one had seen. There was printed ink there, not handwriting. A line of dark blue italic lettering, the expensive typeface used by companies that wanted to look like banks, ran along the old crease of a box lid. Harrogate Capital, Asset Services Department, Providence, Rhode Island. Raphael kept his hand inside his coat. He didn't pull the cardboard back out. He knew that kind of records box. He had seen them stacked in the hallways of buildings their former owners no longer had the right to enter. They were delivered directly to people's doors, printed with a return address, and accompanied by a polite letter requesting that the homeowner surrender every original document for review. That box had arrived at June Briscoe's home on some forgotten day, and by the time everything else was gone, it was the only thing left strong enough to carry her belongings. She had torn off the lid. She had written her plea for help on the very thing that had taken her home away, and she had no idea. Raphael watched her bend down to adjust the chain around Sarge's neck, and in that moment he decided he wouldn't say anything tonight. "The car is over there," he said. The staircase to the third floor was narrow and steep, and Sarge had to stop twice on the landings. June stopped with him both times, one hand resting lightly beneath his belly without lifting him, simply holding it there in case he needed her. Raphael walked ahead, unlocked the door, pushed it open, then stepped completely back into the hallway and remained there. He didn't enter with her. He placed the key on top of the cabinet beside the doorway, pointed toward the bathroom, then toward the fire escape behind the kitchen, told her Rosalie's telephone number was taped to the refrigerator door, wished her good night, and went downstairs. June listened as his footsteps faded, waited until she heard the door below close, and only then allowed herself to cross the threshold. The apartment was small, with low ceilings, and clean in the particular way of a place no one had ever lived in long enough to dirty. There was a bed against one wall, a table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the street, where the restaurant sign cast a dim red glow across the ceiling. 10 minutes later, someone knocked, 3 slow knocks, and a woman's voice called through the door that she was Rosalie from downstairs, and that she was holding a pot with both hands, so she couldn't open the door herself. June opened it. The 71-year-old woman stood there with a steaming pot of pasta wrapped in dish towels, a wool blanket folded into a neat square over one arm, and not a single question on her face. She walked straight into the kitchen, set the pot on the stove, placed the blanket over the back of a chair, looked around once as though checking whether the apartment was fulfilling its duty, then lowered her eyes to the dog standing at June's left side. She didn't ask permission to touch him. She didn't touch him either. "The dog can sleep wherever he wants," she said. "Just don't let him sleep on the cold floor." Then she pointed to the blanket, gave one firm nod, and walked out. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes, and she never asked June's name. June stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. Then she spread the blanket in the corner near the heater, folded one edge over to make it thicker, and called Sarge. He came over, sniffed the blanket, then looked at her. He didn't lie down. He walked around her to the space between the bed and the front door, turned once in a circle, and lowered himself there, slowly, one careful stage at a time, in the same way she had watched him do thousands of times. He lay with his head facing the door. June ate 2 bowls of pasta while standing at the stove, because she didn't believe she would be able to rise again if she sat down. She washed the pot. She wiped the stove, even though it wasn't dirty. She checked the door bolt 3 times, and each time she twisted the handle to make certain it held. Then she sat on the edge of the bed. She remained there for 20 minutes. She didn't take off her coat. She listened to the pipes inside the walls, to a car passing on the street below, to the distant clatter of dishes rising through the floor from the restaurant kitchen. For 18 months, she had slept in cars, beneath the awning behind the delivery area, and on plastic chairs in hospital corridors, and in every one of those places, she had known exactly where she was. Here, she didn't. At last, she lowered herself onto the bed and lay on her side, her knees drawn up, her face turned toward the door. She left her shoes on. In the darkness, she listened to Sarge breathing from the space between her and the door, steady and slow, in and out, and she counted each breath until she could no longer count. The following night, Raphael went up to the 3rd floor at nearly 10 o'clock, after the restaurant had closed, and knocked 3 times in exactly the way Rosalie had. June opened the door. She had taken off her shoes. Her hair was tied back more neatly, and the scent of cheap soap from the bathroom still lingered in the room. There were 2 plates on the table and another pot of pasta, also from Rosalie, because she had come up at 7 without asking anyone. Raphael pulled out a chair and sat down, but he didn't take a plate. He poured himself a glass of water and rested his hands around it. June ate half her plate, then set down her fork. "You want to know what happened?" she said. "I want to know who's standing on the other side." She looked down at the tabletop. In the corner of the kitchen, Sarge lay on the folded wool blanket, his good ear moving slightly with every sentence. "My father left when I was little," June said. "My mother never told me where he went. I asked twice, then stopped asking, because every time I did, she scrubbed the stove longer than usual." She pulled her sleeve down over her wrist. "My mother's name was Doreen. She worked at the Point Judith seafood packing plant for more than 20 years. Night shift, because night shift paid an extra $1 an hour. She took the 4 o'clock bus to work and came home at 7 in the morning. And in all those years, I never heard her complain about it once." Raphael didn't ask another question. He let the silence do its work. "My brother was Wade, 4 years older than me. He managed the guard dogs at the ocean freight yard. He wasn't a dock officer, he handled the animals, fed them, kept their kennels clean, maintained their records. He was better with dogs than he was with people." She gave a faint laugh, a short sound with nothing joyful in it. "The day he brought Sarge home, he parked on the street and sat in the car for 10 minutes because he was afraid our mother would yell at him. We were behind on the electric bill. Then he carried Sarge inside, set him down on the kitchen floor, and told us that even if others thought the dog was too old, our family had enough room in our hearts for him." June stopped. My mother didn't say anything. She took out an old pot, filled it with water, and set it beside the stove. That was that. Raphael turned the glass once against the tabletop. "Where is your brother now?" "He died when I was 22. She said it in the even voice of someone who had repeated the sentence many times and had learned how to say it without breaking. For the last 3 years, he wasn't himself anymore. It started with painkillers after an injury at work, then became something else. My mother brought him home 4 times. The 5th time, she was too late. In the kitchen, Sarge shifted and rested his chin on the other leg. After that, it was just my mother, me, and the dog. 3 years later, she started having stomach pain." June picked up her fork, then put it down again. "Ovarian cancer. Stage 3. They told her in a small room with a painting of the ocean on the wall. And I remember staring at that painting the whole time because I was afraid to look at her face. 18 months. Chemotherapy. A pause. Chemotherapy again. Surgery. Then more chemotherapy. I missed too much work, so the plant let me go. They weren't cruel about it. They gave me 2 weeks' notice." "And the hospital bills?" $61,000, she said. "After insurance paid its share. I know that number the way I know my own birthday." Raphael gave the smallest nod. Then the papers started coming. June looked up. "You know?" "I know the sequence." She drew a breath. First came the notice about overdue property taxes. Then the building code notices. The porch, the steps, the paint. Our house was in Warwick, wood frame, bought by my mother when she was 26, close enough to the bay for real estate companies to call it a vacation rental opportunity. They called constantly. My mother refused every one of them for as long as she could still hold a telephone. She wrapped both hands around her elbows. Then she went into the hospital for the last time, and I signed. Raphael didn't move. A man came to the hospital. He was well-dressed, soft-spoken, Said he wanted to help make everything less complicated. He brought a stack of papers in a plastic folder, showed me where to sign, explained each one, temporary authorization, so they could deal with the county office on our behalf, permission for an appraisal, copies for the assessors. I asked whether it meant we were selling the house, and he said no. It was only a procedure to put the building code penalties on hold. She looked down at her hands. I signed 5 papers in the 4th floor hallway of the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning while my mother was breathing through a machine in the room across from me. I didn't read a single word. She raised her eyes, and for the first time in 2 days, there was something close to anger in her voice. I was 27 years old, and I didn't read a single word. Raphael let that sentence remain between them for a moment. Then he asked only one question. "Do you still have the papers?" June looked at him. "Yes," she said. "In a plastic bag. My mother kept everything, so I did too. I don't know whether any of it matters." It might. At 6 o'clock the following morning, the delivery truck pulled into the courtyard behind the restaurant, and when Raphael came around the building, he found June already there, her sleeves rolled up, dragging a crate of cod from the edge of the truck bed onto a cart. No one had asked her to work. Rosalie stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded across her chest, watching, and she didn't stop her. Raphael removed his coat, draped it over the railing, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped to the other end of the crate. Together they carried it down, then the next one, then the one after that. Sarge lay on the kitchen threshold in the first strip of morning sunlight, his eyes half closed, his good ear turned toward the noise. "You don't have to do this," Raphael said. "I know." June pushed the crate into place with her knee. "That's why I'm doing it." Crushed ice rattled across the wet concrete. The smell of the sea and diesel fuel mingled in the cold air. 61,000, Raphael said. He didn't look at her. He was pulling the plastic wrap from the top of a crate. "I can pay it. This afternoon. One phone call." June stopped for perhaps 2 seconds, then continued working. "No, I didn't say it would be a loan." "I know you didn't say it would be a loan." She pushed her hair back with her wrist because her hands were wet. "That's the problem." She rolled the cart toward the kitchen door, came back, and this time she looked at him, though she kept working as she spoke, and they both understood that talking this way was easier than sitting across from each other at a table. "If you pay it, I'll owe you instead of the bank. At least the bank doesn't look at me every morning." Raphael didn't answer. He had heard many people refuse his money over the past 15 years, and most of them had only been bargaining. This woman wasn't. "Besides," June said, and this was where her voice changed. "Paying it wouldn't do any good." He looked up. "The second week after my mother's funeral, I went to the Kent County Courthouse. Every Tuesday they set up a table in the hallway with a lawyer offering free advice. 15 minutes per person. I got in line at 7. My turn came at 11:20. She pulled the next crate toward her. I brought the whole plastic bag of papers. That lawyer looked at them for maybe 4 minutes. Then she asked me one question I've never forgotten. She asked whether I had money. I said no. She said good, because even if you did, you'd only spend it in the wrong place." Raphael placed a hand on the edge of the crate and stopped. This is how she explained it. June continued in an even voice, as though reciting something she had memorized by repeating it inside her head too many times. "That $61,000 hospital bill is medical debt. It's bad. It follows you. But it isn't what's taking my house. It was only their excuse to get a seat at the table. What's taking my house is the paperwork I signed in the 4th floor hallway at 3 o'clock in the morning. That authorization was written too broadly. Broad enough for them to deal with the county office in my name, file documents, request an appraisal, and start the transfer process without ever asking me again." She dropped the crate more heavily than necessary. "Even if I somehow found $61,000 and paid the entire debt today, the transfer paperwork would still keep moving tomorrow. Money can't touch it. My signature can." Raphael stood motionless in the courtyard, surrounded by the smell of fish and the cold morning air, both hands still wet. For 15 years, he had solved almost everything with a single tool, and now a 27-year-old woman was telling him that tool was useless. "Then what does it take?" he asked. She said, "I have to prove I was misled into signing. I have to know exactly what they did and when they did it. I need dates, copies, signatures, and someone willing to read every page." June gave a small shrug. Then she looked at the clock, "Because my 15 minutes were over." He nodded slowly. "The truth, not money." He put that sentence away carefully. the way a man returned a knife to its sheath. They unloaded the final 4 crates in silence. When June pulled the tarp back into place and rubbed her reddened hands together for warmth, she said without looking at anyone, "I used to have a home that was good enough to take in a foster child, you know." Raphael stopped moving, back when my mother was still healthy. We had a spare room, a yard, and a dog. They approved the application, then they brought Poppy to us. She was 6. She lived with my mother and me for 8 months. June rolled the tarp carefully, one neat turn at a time. She liked to sit on the front step and watch Sarge sleep. She gave him another name, and I can't remember what it was anymore. I'm angry with myself for that. She paused. Then her aunt finished the process. They reviewed everything, found her qualified, and the day came for Poppy to be transferred. The case closed. She went to live with her aunt. Raphael waited. He waited for the part where someone had done something wrong. "No one did anything wrong," June said. "Her aunt was a good woman. Poppy went back to her own family, exactly the way she was supposed to. Everyone did their part correctly." She placed the rolled tarp on the cart. "That's what makes it hard. There's no one to blame. There was only that room afterward, and it stayed empty forever." That night, Raphael didn't return to his penthouse apartment. He stayed at the restaurant until well past midnight, reviewing accounts he didn't truly need to review, then went up to the 3rd floor, knocked 3 times, told June he would sleep in the outer room that night, and offered no explanation. He told himself it was a matter of security. Bud Mahoney had looked at him with the eyes of a calculating man, and men like that often returned after everyone had stopped expecting them. That was the reason Raphael gave himself, and it was sufficient. He removed his shoes, loosened his collar, leaned back on the couch against the wall, and rested one arm across his chest. The restaurant sign below cast a dim red glow across the ceiling, faded out, then came alive again. He fell asleep more quickly than he expected, and the dream came at once, without an introduction, because it had never needed one. 4 years earlier, the telephone vibrated on the table while he sat at table number 4, and he saw the name glowing on the screen, and he didn't answer because someone was speaking to him about a waterfront contract, and he thought he would return the call after dinner. The call lasted 22 seconds, then ended. In the dream, that telephone kept vibrating without ever stopping, and he kept staring at it, and his hand couldn't rise. Then came the corridor, then a gray painted steel door, the kind with no handle on the inside. Then came the 10 minutes. 10 minutes he had counted and recounted for 4 years like a madman repeating a division problem that would never come out evenly. 10 minutes between the moment the first call ended and the moment the telephone rang again. And in the dream he was always running down that corridor, and the corridor was always growing longer. Someone called his name. It wasn't Nico. Nico never called to him in this dream. That was the worst part, that his younger brother had never once opened his mouth, but only stood at the far end of the corridor with his back turned, 19 years old, narrow-shouldered, waiting. Raphael woke with a violent start, his entire body rigid. He didn't bolt upright. He didn't cry out. His body had learned long ago that panic must never make a sound. So all that happened was that both hands clenched into fists, his jaw locked tight, and his eyes opened wide, staring at the dim red ceiling without seeing anything at all. His heart pounded so hard that he could hear it inside his ears. In the darkness, from the corner of the room, came the quiet tapping of claws against the wooden floor. Sarge had risen. Raphael heard the entire process, the front legs bracing first, a pause, then the hindquarters pushing upward, slowly and painfully, the 11-year-old body paying a price for every movement. Then came the sound of paws crossing the floor, unhurried and steady, and the dog stopped less than a hand's breadth from the couch. He didn't climb up. He didn't press his nose into Raphael's hand. He didn't lick him. He simply sat down, just as slowly, turned to face the door as he always did, and began to breathe. In, out, deep, even, never hurried. Raphael remained still. He didn't understand why, but he could hear that breathing more clearly than the pounding of his own heart. In, out. Raphael released a long breath. In, out. His fingers opened from the fist, one at a time. His jaw unclenched. The dim red ceiling became a ceiling again. The room returned in pieces. The table, the window frame, the sound of pipes inside the wall, the smell of inexpensive soap. Raphael turned his head. The old dog sat there in the darkness, silver around his muzzle, one ear raised and the other folded, not looking at him, merely sitting, merely breathing, as though this were part of a duty he had performed thousands of times for hundreds of people, and saw no reason to make anything of it. Raphael reached out his hand. He stopped halfway, then lowered it to the floor, palm facing upward, and left it there. Sarge didn't come closer. He didn't move away either. He simply continued to breathe. A long while later, blankets rustled from the direction of the bed. June was awake. She lay on her side with her eyes open, and she had watched everything from the beginning. But she didn't sit up. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't cross the room, didn't ask whether Raphael was all right, didn't ask what he had dreamed. She remained where she was, and after a very long time, she said quietly, her voice rough with sleep, "He does better when people don't rush him." Raphael didn't answer. He lay there with his open hand resting on the wooden floor, and the dog breathing beside him, and for the first time in 4 years, he was able to fall asleep again after waking in the middle of the night. No one ever mentioned that night again, and perhaps that was why everything afterward became easier. The next morning, June came down to the restaurant kitchen at 7 o'clock and began washing dishes. No one had told her to. The large sink in the far corner, where the hot water ran slowly and the drain was always clogging, was the place the younger kitchen helpers kept pushing onto one another, and she simply stepped into it, rolled up her sleeves, and worked for 4 hours. Rosalie walked past 3 times, watched her, and said nothing. The second day was the same. On the third day, Rosalie took a faded canvas apron from a drawer, all game she kept for herself rather than the kind issued to employees, and laid it across the edge of the sink. "Tie it in front," she said. "If you tie it behind you, it pulls on your neck." Then she walked away. June stared at the apron for nearly half a minute before picking it up. Raphael had work of his own to do. On Thursday afternoon, he returned and placed a large container of joint supplements for dogs on the kitchen table upstairs, the kind with glucosamine, enough to last 3 months. He told June that the place where he usually bought supplies was clearing out items close to their expiration date, that the price had been reduced to 1/3, and that it would be a waste not to buy them. June picked up the container and turned it around once. The price sticker was still on the lid, and the amount printed there was $42. She set it down, thanked him, and said nothing more. From that day forward, every morning she broke 1 tablet into Sarge's bowl, and every morning Raphael saw her do it, and they both continued to honor the story about the discounted stock nearing its expiration date, because an unspoken agreement between 2 adults was sometimes the kindest thing they could offer each other. Sarge, meanwhile, found himself a job. There were 4 chairs in the 3rd-floor kitchen, and the 3rd chair had 1 leg slightly shorter than the others. So after every meal, it always ended up sitting about a hand's breadth out of line. On the second morning in the apartment, Sarge walked over, nudged the chair leg 3 times with his nose, pushed it back into place, stepped away to inspect it, and only then went to eat. He did the same thing on the 3rd morning. On the 4th morning, June deliberately pulled the chair even farther out to see what he would do, and the old dog abandoned the bowl waiting for him, walked around the table, and pushed the chair back into place with the same 3 nudges of his nose. June laughed. The sound came out louder than she intended and filled the small kitchen, and she immediately covered her mouth with 1 hand, like someone who had just dropped and broken something. Raphael was standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee in his hand, and he turned to look at her. They both stood still. She lowered her hand, her face turning red. "I'm sorry." "For what?" She opened her mouth, then couldn't find an answer. And that was the answer. Raphael took a sip of coffee so he wouldn't have to say anything more, but as he went down the stairs, he realized he was smiling, and the moment he noticed it, he stopped. That afternoon, he called her into the courtyard behind the restaurant, in the space between 2 large trash bins and the brick wall, where a little sunlight still reached the ground. Sarge lay on the kitchen step watching them. "Stand here," Raphael said, pointing to the concrete. "Face me." June stepped into place, feet parallel, arms hanging at her sides, shoulders drawn slightly inward. Raphael watched her for 3 seconds. "You're standing like an open door," he said. "Only 3 things. Learn these 3 and nothing more." He turned his body 45 degrees. "First, don't stand squarely in front of anyone. Angle your shoulders. A person who stands square is either ready to take a blow or ready to give one, and you don't want either." She angled her shoulders. "Second, he moved 1 foot back, 1 foot behind you, not so you can run, so you have somewhere to move. People only crowd those who have nowhere left to step. June copied him stiffly, and her body apologized before her mouth had a chance to. Raphael didn't touch her to correct her stance. He simply repeated the movement more slowly so she could watch. The third is the hardest. He stood straight again. Say no without explaining. She frowned. What if they ask why? Then you say no again. That sounds rude. It is. Raphael nodded. And that's why it works. He stepped half a pace closer, just enough for her to feel the distance change. June, the man who stood too close to you in that parking lot didn't want the dog. He wanted you occupied with explaining yourself. As long as you're explaining, you're still standing there. And as long as you're standing there, he's winning. Don't argue with someone who only wants to keep you busy explaining. June looked down at her feet. One forward, one back, shoulders angled. She remained that way for a long time. I apologize too much, don't I? She said. Only people who are used to searching for an escape can hear it, Raphael replied. On the kitchen step, Sarge gave an enormous yawn, rose in his slow and careful way, and walked inside, as though the lesson had already gone on longer than necessary. It happened on a Saturday afternoon during the break between shifts, when only 2 women and a pot of stock simmering gently remained in the kitchen. Rosalie was straining chicken bones, her hands working while her eyes never left the basket, and June stood beside her grating carrots. Outside, darkness had already fallen at 4 o'clock. The early November kind of darkness. You've been here 3 weeks now, Rosalie said. Yes. Are you sleeping yet? June paused for a moment, then continued grating. Yes, ma'am. Rosalie nodded. She picked a small bone from the basket, examined it, then dropped it into the pot. I've known him since he wasn't tall enough to see over this table. I cooked his first meal here when he was 7. His father brought him in, sat him at table number 4, and made him finish everything on his plate before he was allowed to get up. She wiped her hands on a towel. For the past 4 years, he's eaten at that same table, alone, at 9 o'clock every night, and he always orders the same dish. Do you know what it is? No, ma'am. The dish his mother used to make. I haven't changed it. He hasn't changed it. And for more than 20 years, no one has changed it. Rosalie set the basket down. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for him. I'm telling you because there's something you need to know, and I'd rather be the one to tell you than have you discover it by yourself one afternoon. June stopped grating. She placed the grater on the cutting board slowly and turned toward her. You need to know before you let your heart go any farther, Rosalie said. She didn't look away. At 71, she looked the younger woman directly in the face. He has his own reason for standing here. The stock rose in a quiet boil, then settled again. What reason? That's his story, not mine. Rosalie shook her head firmly. I won't tell it. If I did, I'd take away his right to tell it himself, and he has very little of that right left. I'm only telling you that the reason exists. He isn't the kind of man who simply stops his car in the middle of a parking lot because of 2 strangers and an old dog. I've known him for 27 years, and I've never seen him do anything like that before. She pulled the pot away from the heat. He's kind to you. That part is real. I can see it. But kindness that has its roots somewhere else is still kindness. You should simply know where those roots are before you lean your entire weight against them. June looked down at the strands of carrots scattered across the cutting board. You think he's using me? No, Rosalie answered at once, and for the first time her voice turned hard. If I believed that, I wouldn't have given you the apron. I think he's trying to do something right because of something old, and I think he hasn't told you what that old thing is. Those are 2 different matters, and either one is something you deserve to understand. She picked up the towel, paused, then added more softly. I buried his father. I buried his mother. 4 years ago, I buried one more person from that family, and since that day, I haven't seen him allow anyone this close. I'm glad, but I'm 71 years old, and I've watched too many young women receive kindness for reasons that didn't reveal themselves until much later. I don't want to watch another one. Then she turned back to the pot, and the conversation ended there, exactly the way conversations with Rosalie always ended, without unnecessary words, without repetition, finished the moment she had said what needed to be said. June grated the rest of the carrots. She washed the cutting board, wiped the sink, hung the apron on its hook, and went upstairs. That evening, Raphael came to the door at nearly 10 o'clock and knocked as he always did. He carried a paper bag filled with bread still warm from the oven downstairs. June opened the door, accepted the bag, thanked him, and set it on the table. She asked whether he was tired. He said no more than usual. She asked whether it was colder outside. He said it was. Then she sat in the chair and looked out the window, and for the next 40 minutes, she spoke exactly 9 sentences to him. Every one of them was polite. Every one of them came at the proper moment. Every one of them was empty. Raphael noticed by the 3rd sentence. He didn't ask. He had spent his entire life in a world where asking the wrong question could be more dangerous than silence, and he was wise enough to understand that some doors closed more tightly the harder a person pushed against them. Sarge lay beneath the table between them, his head turned toward the door. At 11 o'clock, Raphael stood, wished her good night, and went downstairs. Neither of them gave a name to the distance that had opened between them. It simply remained there in the small kitchen, between the untouched bag of bread and an old dog breathing steadily. That distance lasted 4 days, and then June broke it herself in the only way she knew how. On Wednesday evening, she pulled the plastic bag of documents from beneath the bed, placed it on the kitchen table, and by the time Raphael came upstairs, she was already sitting there waiting. She said nothing about Rosalie. She simply opened the bag, removed a stack of envelopes gone soft with age, and from the middle of them took a photograph protected inside a sheet of cardboard folded in half so it wouldn't bend. She pushed it across the table. "This was the house," she said. The photograph had been taken during some summer long ago. It showed a 2-story wooden house, once painted white, but faded now to ivory, with a porch running across the entire front, blue-painted railings, and 2 steps leading down to a patch of grass. 3 people stood on the porch. The woman in the middle wore her hair in a bun, her sleeves rolled up, her hands broad from a lifetime of physical work. To the left stood a girl of about 18, thinner then, her hair loose, laughing at someone beyond the edge of the frame. To the right was a young man in the dark blue work jacket of the harbor yard crew, a company emblem on his sleeve, his hair cut high and close, his posture carrying the slight awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to photographs. He was bending down a little, his right hand resting lightly on the back of a massive Neapolitan Mastiff's neck. The dog was young in the picture. His slate coat was smooth and dark, his chest immensely broad, his heavy jowls neat and firm. He sat on the top step with his front legs straight, looking toward the left side of the frame instead of at the camera. "That's my mother," June said, "and this is Wade." Raphael picked up the photograph. He meant to study the porch, because the porch was what someone was trying to take from her, and he already had a list of questions in his mind about the steps, the paint, and the building code notices. But he didn't look at the porch. He looked at the man in uniform. The face was young, open, slightly self-conscious, and the hand resting on the dog's neck wasn't gripping or restraining. It was simply there. It was the hand of someone who understood that the dog didn't need to be held, only to know that someone was near. Raphael had seen that kind of hand before. He didn't know where. He held the photograph longer than necessary, long enough for June to notice. "What is it?" "Nothing." He put it down. "How long did your brother work at Cranston?" 7 years. He nodded and turned to the stack of envelopes, and for the next 2 hours they sorted the papers into 4 piles across the table. Hospital bills in one, tax notices in another, company letters in a third, and everything they didn't know where to place in the last. But throughout the evening, each time June lowered her head to read a line, Raphael glanced toward the photograph lying near the edge of the table. What neither of them said, because one didn't believe it mattered and the other didn't know, was that 2 days earlier June had begun doing something on her own. She had found the telephone number for the Kent County Land Records office on an old notice and called. The first call came Monday morning, when a woman answered and told her she needed the parcel number. The second came Monday afternoon, after she had searched through the documents and found it, and this time they told her a transfer filing was already being processed. But if she wanted details, she would have to submit a written request. The third call came Tuesday morning, when she asked who had filed the papers, and the person on the other end went silent for a moment, before telling her to leave her name and telephone number, and that someone would call her back. June gave her name. June gave the telephone number of the landline in the 3rd-floor apartment. She hung up and felt, for the first time in 7 months, that she was doing something instead of merely enduring. She didn't tell Raphael because she believed this belonged to her, and because for once she wanted to save herself. She didn't know that every search request at the county records office was entered into a log, and that anyone with legal standing in the case had the right to see that log. That night, Raphael went downstairs, crossed the darkened restaurant kitchen, and returned to his penthouse apartment. He didn't turn on the main lights. He walked directly into the inner room, opened the lowest cabinet, and pulled out a square tin box, the kind used for holiday cookies, its lid dented at one corner. He set it on the floor and sat beside it. He hadn't opened it in 4 years. The lid came free with a dry snap, sending a thin layer of dust into the air. Inside was a wristwatch with glass cracked like a spider web. Its hand stopped at 1:17. Beneath it was an unlabeled cassette tape. Beneath that was a stack of photographs held together by a rubber band that had rotted with age, and when he tried to remove it, it broke in his hands. He turned through the pictures one by one. Nico at 7, Nico at 12 holding a fishing rod, Nico at 16 standing outside the restaurant, all elbows and knees, grinning shamelessly. Then came a photograph unlike the others, taken with a cheap camera, coarse with grain, washed in harsh sunlight. It showed a concrete yard with a chain-link fence behind it. 4 inmates in gray uniforms stood in a row, and Nico stood second from the left, 19 years old, his head shaved, far thinner than in the photograph before it. Behind that line of men, about 3 paces away, stood a man in a dark blue harbor jacket with an emblem on the sleeve. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was bending beside a broad-headed Neapolitan mastiff, trembling at the sound of a siren somewhere beyond the frame, and his right hand rested lightly on the back of the dog's neck, not gripping, not restraining, simply resting there. Raphael brought the photograph closer to his eyes, and he remained motionless on the floor for a very long time, surrounded by old pictures, with the name already forming in his mind before he had even read the insignia. There was exactly one man in Rhode Island who had ever returned money from the Caruso family, and Raphael had remembered his name for 11 years because of that alone. Curtis Hale lived on the ground floor of a divided house in Cranston, less than 3 miles from the prison, and on Friday morning Raphael drove there himself, alone, parked on the street, and walked to the door. The man who answered wore a crewneck sweater, his silver hair cut neatly, and he didn't look surprised in the slightest. "I've been expecting you since the day at the parking lot," Curtis said. "You were sitting in the cafe. I've sat there 3 mornings a week since 2019. He stepped back and opened the way. "Come in." The living room held 2 chairs, a low table, and photographs of dogs on the walls, not people. Curtis poured coffee without asking whether Raphael wanted any. "In 2015, your people came looking for me," he said as he sat down. "I was still working investigations then. There was a case involving a warehouse on Allen's Avenue. Someone left an envelope on my kitchen table. I remember. I returned it to the front door of your restaurant. Your cook took it, and she even invited me to dinner." Curtis took a sip. "I turned down the dinner too. That's the part I regret. I've heard she's an excellent cook." Raphael didn't smile. He placed the envelope containing the photograph on the table but didn't open it yet. "I need an investigator. I'm retired. I know. I need an investigator I can't buy." Curtis set down his cup. He studied Raphael for a long time, and there was no fear in his gaze, only the careful judgment of a man who had spent 30 years deciding whether people were telling the truth. "The dog in the parking lot that day," he said. "His name is Sarge." "Sarge," Curtis nodded slowly. "I trained him when he was 14 months old. He entered the Correctional Working Dog Program in 2015, and I handled outside evaluation and training under contract. He was the smartest dog I ever worked with, and the hardest, because he wouldn't work for anyone he didn't trust. They sent him back twice before I took him." He pointed toward the photographs on the wall. "You won't find his picture up there. I don't photograph dogs while they're working." Then he said firmly, "I'll do it. But let me make one thing clear. I trained that dog. I'm doing this for him, not for you." "Fine," Raphael said. "You'll pay by the hour, at the rate I set, and I'll issue an invoice with the taxes listed." "Fine. And if I find something you don't like, I'll tell you anyway." Raphael nodded, not yet knowing what he had just agreed to. He opened the envelope. He had intended to bring out the records for the house in Warwick, the name Harrogate, the name Philip Tannehill, and an entire list of things that needed to be uncovered. But the first thing he removed was the photograph of the concrete yard with the chain-link fence, because he hadn't been able to think about anything else all night. He slid it across the table. The man in uniform. Curtis picked up the photograph and held it farther away because his eyesight had weakened, and he recognized the man immediately. Raphael saw it on his face. "Wade Briscoe," Curtis said. You knew him. I worked with him for 4 years in that program. Curtis placed the photograph on the table but kept his hand resting on it. He was the best man there. I mean that. Dogs know who is kind and who is only pretending, and every one of them followed him. He paused. And this man, he said, pointing to the row of figures in gray, second from the left, that's your brother, Nico Caruso. I know. Curtis looked up. Did you come here because of the house in Warwick? Or did you come because of this? I came because of the house, Raphael said. I didn't know this existed until last night. Curtis Hale sat silently for a long time. Then he stood, went into the back room, and returned with a yellowed file folder. He didn't open it immediately. I'm about to tell you something, he said, and you're going to wish I hadn't, but I warned you. He sat down. In 2022, there was a drug smuggling operation through the port supply warehouses. It didn't come through standard customs. It came through the freight yard. No one traced it for 3 months because the packages traveled inside industrial crate liners. Raphael didn't move. The yard dogs detected it. Not Sarge, another dog, but the man who handled the report was Wade Briscoe. He filed 3 reports in 2 weeks, with dates, times, locations, and the names of 2 employees who were being paid to look the other way. Curtis opened the folder, turned to the 4th page, and rotated it toward Raphael. Those reports triggered an internal investigation. They reorganized the entire B unit. 31 inmates were transferred to other units within 9 days. He placed one finger on a bold line in the middle of the page. Your brother was the 19th name on the list. Raphael looked down at the name. Nico Caruso, B unit to D unit, March 11th. He knew March 11th. He had known that date for 4 years. He had simply never known why. Wade didn't report your brother, Curtis said, his voice slowing. Careful now, like a man stepping across thin ice. He didn't know who your brother was. The name Caruso doesn't appear on a single line of those 3 reports. He reported a smuggling operation, and he had no control whatsoever over the process that followed. He tapped the folder lightly with one finger. Wade Briscoe didn't kill anyone. He was only one link in a chain of people who all did their part correctly. Raphael remained still. In his mind, a long corridor ending at a gray steel door was opening, and for the first time in 4 years, it led somewhere instead of stretching endlessly ahead. 3 weeks after the transfer, he learned what happened in D Unit, Curtis said. Every member of staff was notified. I was there that day. He read the notice, folded it, put it in his pocket, and finished his shift as though nothing had happened. He closed the folder. 3 months later, he resigned. I called him 4 times. He answered once and said he was fine. 3 years later, I heard the news. Curtis looked directly into Raphael's face. I've told this story to exactly one person before you, and that person was my wife. Wade Briscoe did exactly what I had trained him to do, and that act killed him more slowly, but no less surely. Raphael drove back to Providence in silence. He couldn't remember when he crossed the bridge. By the time he reached the restaurant, it was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. He climbed to the 3rd floor by the rear staircase, and the apartment was dark because June was downstairs helping with the evening shift. He placed the tin box on the kitchen table. On top of it, he laid the copy of the 4th page Curtis had given him, with Nico's name on the 3rd line from the top. He meant to put it away. Instead, he stood there staring at it, then walked out onto the rear balcony, sat on the iron steps, and remained there until daylight. In 15 years, Raphael Caruso had never allowed a single piece of paper to remain out of place. That night, he didn't remember it even once. June came up to the 3rd floor at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, so exhausted that she only managed to remove her shoes before lying down, and because she didn't turn on the kitchen light, she saw nothing. At 6 o'clock she woke before Sarge, walked into the kitchen through the pale gray light coming through the window, and found an open tin box on the table that hadn't been there the night before. She stood looking at it for several seconds. One corner of the lid was dented, and inside she could see a wristwatch with cracked glass and a cassette tape, while on top, lying neatly as though someone had just placed it there and forgotten, was a photocopied page. She read the heading first: Rhode Island Department of Corrections, Housing Unit Transfer List, March Round. Then her eyes dropped to the first 3 lines, and on the 3rd line there was a name: Nico Caruso, Unit B to Unit D, March 11th. June pulled out a chair and sat down. She read the entire page. Then she turned it over, and began again from the top. In the lower left corner was a small, italicized note stating that the transfer round had been carried out in accordance with the findings of an internal investigation initiated by Incident Report number 784, dated February 27th. Beneath that number, in parentheses, was the name of the person who had filed the report. W. Briscoe. She sat perfectly still. In the kitchen, the refrigerator began to hum, then fell silent again. She lifted the photograph from the box and saw the concrete yard, the chain-link fence, the 4 men dressed in gray, and her brother standing behind them, with one hand resting lightly on the back of a dog's neck. She had known that hand all her life. She stared at the photograph for a long time. An understanding came to her piece by piece, slowly, like cold water soaking through cloth. She understood why her brother had become what he had during those final 3 years. She understood why he had left his job without explaining. She understood why he had never said another word to their mother about Cranston after that spring. She had lived for 5 years with a question, and now she had the answer, and she took it into herself without making a sound. The door opened. Raphael stepped in from the balcony, still wearing his coat, his face hollow after a night spent outside. He saw her sitting at the table, saw the paper in her hand, and stopped in the middle of the kitchen. He said nothing. "How long have you known?" June asked. Her voice was so ordinary that it was frightening. "Since yesterday." "What time yesterday?" "In the afternoon, around 4 o'clock. She nodded. "So 14 hours. June. Did you come through the kitchen last night?" "Yes." She still didn't look up. "You walked past me while I was standing at the sink. You asked whether the cracks in my hands were getting better. I said they were. You said good." Raphael remained still. "I'm not angry because of this." She laid the page flat on the table and smoothed a crease in one corner. "Listen carefully. I'm not angry because my brother wrote that report. My brother did the right thing. Someone was smuggling drugs into the same place where drugs had already destroyed him, and he reported it, and I'm proud of him for that. I've been sitting here all morning, and I'm proud of him." Now she looked up. "I'm angry because you knew and chose not to tell me." Raphael opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Do you understand how many days I've been here?" June said. "I sleep in your bed. I eat the food Rosalie cooks. I let you teach me how to stand so people can't corner me. And all last night, while I was washing dishes downstairs, you sat on the balcony with this lying on the table, and you decided for me that I didn't need to know yet." She didn't raise her voice. That was what made the words so heavy. "A man once sat beside my mother's hospital bed, handed me a stack of papers, and told me to sign here, here, and here, and told me not to worry, and he decided for me that I didn't need to know yet either. I'm not that man. I know you're not." June stood, but what you did was exactly the same. Raphael lifted one hand, then lowered it again. For 15 years, he had sat across from men who wanted to kill him, and still found words to say. Now he couldn't. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" He remained silent. "How long were you going to keep it from me?" He had no answer. He truly had none, and that truth showed more clearly on his face than any words could have, because while sitting on the balcony the night before, he had gone over that question 100 times and stopped in the same place every time. He wasn't afraid of her learning about Wade. He was afraid of her learning that 4 years earlier, he had sat inside his own restaurant and watched his telephone vibrate for 22 seconds without picking it up. June watched him and waited, and when nothing came, something in her face closed. "All right," she said. She still went down to the kitchen that day. She washed dishes during the lunch shift, worked the evening shift, hung her apron on its hook at 10 o'clock as she always did, and wished Rosalie good night at the foot of the stairs. The older woman watched her climb all 3 flights. Near midnight, June folded the wool blanket Rosalie had given her and placed it over the back of the chair, exactly where Rosalie had left it on the first night. She left the apron draped across the chair. She left the key on top of the cabinet beside the entrance, where Raphael had placed it. She took her canvas bag, the plastic bag of documents, and her thin coat. She didn't take the joint supplements because she thought they belonged to him. Then she reconsidered and took them. Sarge rose when she picked up the chain, slowly, one careful stage at a time, and he didn't ask where they were going. She didn't write a single word. The door downstairs closed at 12:20, so softly that Rosalie, lying awake on the floor below, heard it only as something like a breath. Rosalie woke him at 12:35 by pounding on the restaurant door downstairs until he came down. She didn't waste words. She told him the girl was gone. The key had been left on the cabinet, the blanket had been folded, and the dog had gone with her. Raphael climbed to the 3rd floor, looked at the apron draped over the back of the chair, looked at the empty space beneath the table where an old dog had lain every day for the past 3 weeks, and took out his telephone. He stood there for a long time with it in his hand. There were 4 numbers he could call. The first man controlled the port. The second had a brother-in-law who worked for the largest taxi company in the city. The third knew every cheap boarding house owner from Pawtucket down to Narragansett. And the fourth didn't need to know anyone, because he had the payroll records of the people who did. Within 2 hours, perhaps less, someone would call back and tell him exactly where a 27-year-old woman traveling with an old mastiff was sitting. Raphael put the telephone back into his pocket. He took his car keys and went downstairs. Rosalie stood at the foot of the staircase, her hair tied beneath a scarf, a robe pulled over her nightclothes. "Have you called your people?" "No. Why not?" He stopped on the last step. "Do you know what happens if I make that call? In 2 hours I know where she is. I drive there, I open the car door, and she learns something." He looked at the old woman. "She learns that there isn't a place in this state she can go where I can't find her. She'll get into the car, she'll come back with me. And from that moment on, every time she stays, she'll never be certain whether she's staying because she wants to or because she knows she can't leave." Raphael pushed open the door. "I don't want her to live with that knowledge." He drove alone throughout the night. First, he went to the parking lot behind the Federal Hill Seafood Market, parked, got out, walked to the awning behind the delivery area, and shone the light from his telephone beneath it. No one was there. He questioned the night guard, an elderly man sitting in a booth with a radio, and the man said he hadn't seen the girl in 2 weeks. Raphael went to the central bus terminal, walked inside, and checked both rows of waiting seats. He passed 3 churches with steps sheltered from the wind. He drove to the loading area at Point Judith and stood outside the fence for 20 minutes, staring in. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he sat inside his car in an empty parking area beside Route 1, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and he thought about the dog. Not June, the dog. An 11-year-old German shepherd with failing hips could only walk so far, and if the person holding the leash had no clear destination, the dog would choose the direction himself, because dogs always chose a direction when the leash went loose. He would go somewhere he knew. Raphael started the engine and drove south, out of the city and down toward Warwick. He searched for the house using the photograph in his mind. Ivory white wood, 2 front steps, blue-painted railings, and he had to drive slowly through 3 streets before he found it. The grass in the yard had grown nearly to his knees. A notice was taped to the front door, one corner peeling away. The sky was shifting from black to gray. She sat on the lowest step, the one broken halfway through, forcing her to sit toward the left side, both arms wrapped around her knees, her canvas bag beside her. Sarge lay at her feet on the damp earth, his head facing the road. He raised it when the car stopped, but he didn't bark. Raphael turned off the engine and remained inside for a while before getting out. He crossed the yard slowly and stopped about 3 paces from where she sat, exactly the distance he had kept in the parking lot on that November afternoon. June didn't look up. "He brought me here," she said, her voice rough from the cold. "I was going to Woonsocket. There's a place there that rents rooms by the week." When we reached the main road, he sat down and wouldn't move. I pulled, but he wouldn't come. When I turned back the other way, he stood up. She lowered one hand to the back of the dog's neck. This was as far as he could make it. I had to let him rest 4 times. Raphael looked up at the railing. The blue paint covered about 2/3 of its length, then stopped abruptly in the middle, while the remaining wood had weathered to the color of ash. He didn't ask. "My mother never finished painting it," June said, as though she had heard the question. "That May, she painted as far as there. Then she felt tired and sat down to rest. The next day she went to the doctor. The paint can is still in the shed." The first bird of morning called somewhere behind the house. Then she lifted her eyes to him and asked the question she had spent the entire night waiting to ask. "Do you forgive my brother?" Raphael didn't answer immediately. He had spent 4 hours driving with that question, and he knew he could lie very easily, and the lie would make things easier for both of them for perhaps 15 minutes. "No," he said. She didn't blink. "I don't forgive him. I tried all night, and I couldn't do it." Every time I came close, I saw that list again, and my brother's name on the third line, and I returned to the same place. He slipped both hands into the pockets of his coat. Maybe one day. I won't promise, because I've made too many promises to myself and failed to keep them. June nodded slowly, and he saw something in her shoulders lower, not from disappointment, but because it was the first honest answer anyone had given her in a very long time. But he's dead, Raphael said, and you aren't. He looked down at the broken step beneath her feet. I'm not wise enough to do both things at once. I can't forgive the dead man and save the living one at the same time. I can only do one, so I'm choosing the one that can still be done. Dew settled over the grass. June remained silent for a long time, then shifted farther to the left on the broken step, leaving just enough room for another person, and Raphael sat beside her. They stayed there until full daylight. The following night, they both returned carrying the plastic bag of documents and 2 flashlights, because the electricity had been disconnected in April. They spread every record across the living room floor, arranged them by date, and worked until well past midnight. Sarge lay on the porch, in the same place where he had rested in the old summer photograph, and he refused to come inside. June's 3 calls were entered into the Kent County Land Records Office search log, 1 line for each call, with the date, the time, the name of the person making the inquiry, and the telephone number she had left. That log wasn't confidential. Anyone named in a filing still under review had the right to request a copy, and on Thursday morning an employee of Harrogate Capital requested one, received it, and sent it up to the 4th floor of the building, at the corner of Westminster and Dorrance. Philip Tannehill read those 3 lines in 4 seconds. What troubled him wasn't that the girl was asking questions. What troubled him was that she was asking the right questions, and if she was asking the right questions, then someone had told her what to ask. He didn't call his lawyer. He called Bud Mahoney, and he said exactly one thing, that every original document still in the other party's possession had to be recovered as soon as possible, and that the house in Warwick had been vacant since spring. The gray pickup truck reached Sherwood Street at 11:40 on Friday night, and parked 3 houses away. Lenny carried a flashlight. Bud carried a short crowbar hidden inside his sleeve, and a folded envelope in his breast pocket. They crossed the wet grass to avoid making noise, and when they came around the shrubs in the front yard, Lenny stopped abruptly. There's light. No lights were on inside the house. The electricity had been disconnected since April. But through the living room window, 2 small circles of yellow light moved slowly across the floor. 2 flashlights resting at an angle against the legs of a chair, casting blurred streaks across the ceiling. Bud stood still for 3 seconds. Then he said quietly, "Keep going." Inside, among the stacks of papers covering the living room floor, Sarge raised his head. He had been lying in the doorway leading to the porch, where he had lain for the past 2 nights, and he lifted his head before anyone heard a sound. There was no noise at all, only the dog's head rising from his front paws, one ear upright, and his entire body shifting from rest to work within the space of a single breath. Raphael saw it. He placed the paper in his hand on the floor. "June." She looked up. "Stand up. Go to the kitchen." Then the sound came, wet grass being crushed underfoot, about 15 paces from the house. Raphael stepped to the front door and turned the lock. He didn't draw anything from his coat. He could have. There was something in the desk drawer of his penthouse apartment, and it had remained there for 4 years, and he hadn't brought it with him when he drove to Warwick, and he knew exactly why he hadn't. He only locked the door, then shoved a low oak cabinet from the wall across the doorway, pushing with his entire body while his shoes slipped against the wooden floor. When it was in place, he reached for the breaker box beside the door and flipped the only switch still connected, the one that powered the porch lights, which ran through the outdoor meter rather than the meter inside the house. All 4 porch lights came on at once. The front yard changed from black to white. The 2 men crossing the lawn suddenly stood exposed in that brightness like men who had stepped onto the wrong stage, and Sarge barked. Once. One single bark from the doorway, short, low, and final. The sound of a dog trained to warn rather than threaten. He didn't charge forward. He didn't bare his teeth. He remained exactly where he was, all 4 paws on the ground, and that sound traveled across the porch and all the way to the street. Lenny dropped the flashlight. He turned and ran back the way he had come, stumbled at the edge of the lawn, then kept running, and 30 seconds later a car door slammed 3 houses away. Bud didn't run. He stood in the middle of the light, slowly pulled his sleeve down over the crowbar, then climbed the 2 front steps and stopped directly in the doorway, outside the cabinet, separated from Raphael by 1 door and 1 piece of wood. He looked straight ahead. "Mr. Caruso." Raphael didn't answer. "I know what you're thinking," Bud said. His voice was still sweet, still leisurely, and it didn't tremble. "You're thinking it's late. The street is empty. The backyard is wide, and I'm standing somewhere I have no right to stand." He nodded toward the inside of the house. "But you can't do anything to me here. Not in this house." He pointed down at the porch floor. "This house has her name on the paperwork. If anything happens here tonight, the police won't come looking for you tomorrow. They'll come looking for the owner. They'll turn over every document she has. They'll ask who was staying with her, how long he had been here, and why." He allowed the words to settle. "You want to win this house back with paperwork. That means you can't leave a single mark on that paperwork. Your hands are tied by the very thing you intended to use against us." Raphael stood motionless behind the door. And the worst part, the thing that tightened every muscle in his body, was that Bud was right. In 15 years, no one had ever stood in front of him and been right in quite that way. "So," Bud said, "you open the door, give me the bag of documents, and I leave. No one has to write anything down." Footsteps sounded behind Raphael. June came forward, stopped just behind his shoulder, and raised her telephone to eye level, the screen glowing, the camera pointed directly through the doorway. Her voice trembled on the first word. Then it steadied. "Bud Mahoney," she said. "Lenny Pogue, you both work for Harrogate Capital. The man who signs your checks is Philip Tannehill, and your office is on the 4th floor of the building at the corner of Westminster and Dorrance." She drew a breath. "It is now 11:47 on Friday night. This is my house. I know both your names, I know who pays you, and I am recording." Bud didn't move for 2 seconds. Then something very small changed in his face. Not fear, but a calculation being started over because a new variable had appeared. He glanced up at the 4 porch lights, shining directly into his face. He thought about the camera. He thought about the fact that everything he had just said now existed inside a file. "Fine," he said. He stepped back. He didn't turn around, and he didn't hurry. 1 step, then another, down both porch steps, moving backward through the light until he reached the edge of the lawn. Only then did he turn and walk away. The folded envelope in his breast pocket had been pushed upward when he pulled down his sleeve, and it slipped out onto the top step without anyone hearing it, remaining there through the night, soaking up the dew. June found it at 7 o'clock in the morning when she went out to the porch to call Sarge in for breakfast. The envelope lay face down on the top step, soaked with dew until it had gone limp, and she had to lift it with both hands to keep it from tearing. Inside were 2 sheets of paper stuck together. She separated them on the kitchen table and spread them flat beneath the light from the window, and Raphael stood beside her, reading with her, neither of them speaking for 2 full minutes. The first page was an internal work order, bearing the heading Harrogate Capital, Asset Services Department. The work address was clearly listed as the Briscoe Residence on Sherwood Street in Warwick. The scope of work was to clear out and liquidate the contents of the house and prepare the property for inspection by a prospective buyer. The scheduled date appeared on the line below, and inside the notes box at the bottom of the page, neatly typed, was a sentence June had to read 3 times. "Do not contact the County Land Records Office until the transfer process has been completed." The second page was a personnel assignment sheet with 2 names, Mahoney and Poag, listed under subcontractors. Raphael placed 1 finger on the scheduled date on the first page. "This date comes before," he said. "Before what?" "Before the date your transfer filing was officially recorded by the county." He looked up. "They scheduled people to empty a house they didn't yet have the legal right to enter." Omar Najjar was a legal aid attorney working from a 2-room office on Broad Street, 45 years old, with thin-framed glasses, and he read every page twice. The first time, quickly. The second time, he took out a pencil and began writing notes in the margins. Curtis Hale brought the rest of the material late the following week, a thick case file containing the results of 11 days spent in the county records office and 3 mornings in the courthouse clerk's office. There was a copy of the authorization June had signed in the hospital corridor, stamped with the time 3:17 in the morning. There was the visitor log from the treatment floor that night. There was a sworn statement from a nurse on duty, who clearly remembered the well-dressed man in the waiting area holding a stack of papers in a plastic folder. There was the search log, showing June's 3 telephone calls, and directly beneath them, on the same date, Harrogate's request for a copy. Omar arranged everything in chronological order and told June that this was no longer merely the story of one person losing her home. It had become a sequence of dates that told the story by itself. He filed a motion to suspend the transfer proceedings on Tuesday morning. 4 days later, the second envelope arrived. It didn't come through the mail. A courier delivered it by hand to the door of the restaurant on Federal Hill, addressed specifically to June Briscoe, and Rosalie signed for it, carried it upstairs, and placed it on the kitchen table. The envelope was thick, made of fine paper, with the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. There was no threat inside. What it contained was a collection of records copied so cleanly and completely that the completeness itself was what sent a chill down the spine. There was a copy of June's application to become a foster family, filed 4 years earlier, bearing both her signature and her mother's. There was a copy of the home assessment report, including the sections on income, room conditions, and the adults residing in the household. There were copies of 3 routine inspection reports, all marked approved. There was a copy of the notice closing the case, stating that a biological relative had completed the requirements necessary to receive the child. Along with those came a copy of June's termination notice from the Point Judith plant, a copy of the foreclosure notice, and a copy of the statement showing $61,000 in medical debt. On top was a typed page, 6 lines long, without a heading or a signature. It stated that the sender regretted having to point out a practical reality. It stated that any review board considered 3 basic factors: stable housing, stable income, and the character and background of the adults residing at the same address. It stated that at the present time, the recipient of the letter possessed none of those 3 things, and that her recorded residence was the 3rd floor of a building owned by the Caruso family. It stated that a file containing facts such as those wouldn't be approved by any board anywhere in the state, at any point in the future. And it stated that if the motion to suspend proceedings was withdrawn within 7 days, the sender was prepared to use his existing connections to ensure that her record remained clean. Not one word mentioned the name of a child. Not one word mentioned the 8 months, the front steps, or any painting. Philip Tannehill had never met June Briscoe, and had no idea what she remembered whenever she passed the empty room on the 2nd floor. He had simply read her file, seen a door that had once opened and then closed, and placed his hand on that exact door. June sat with those papers for the entire afternoon. She didn't cry. She read those 6 lines perhaps 40 times, and each time she did, a voice inside her told her that he was right, that she had none of those 3 things, that if she withdrew the motion, she would lose a house she had already lost and preserve at least the possibility of something else. Sarge lay beneath the table. Raphael didn't come upstairs. Rosalie came up once, looked at June's face, then went back down without asking a question. At nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, June stood, walked into the inner room, and remained for a long time in the place that had once been the small bedroom. Then she came back out, arranged every page in the exact order in which it had arrived, placed the entire file inside the envelope, and called Omar Najjar. She drove Raphael's car to Broad Street with him sitting in the passenger seat, and she didn't speak once during the entire journey. At the office, she placed the envelope on Omar's desk and pushed it toward him. "Read this." Omar read it. He read slowly, and when he reached the 4th line, he looked up at her, then lowered his eyes and finished. He placed the page down very gently, as though afraid of wrinkling it. "Do you understand what this is?" he said. "It's him telling me to withdraw the motion." "No." Omar removed his glasses. "This is a proposed exchange tied to an administrative proceeding, sent in writing to a party who is currently involved in a legal dispute with the sender." He placed both hands on the desk. "June, he has just typed out the very thing we've spent the past 6 months trying to prove through indirect evidence." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you've just brought me the strongest piece of evidence in this entire case," Omar said. "And the person who gave it to me was him. There were no sirens. No one was led away in handcuffs from the building at the corner of Westminster and Dorrance. Everything happened through copies, dates, signatures, and stamped envelopes moving through the mail at the speed of the mail." Omar Najjar filed a supplemental motion on Monday morning, and that edition was only 6 pages long. But the 2nd page was a copy of the unsigned 6-line typed letter, and the 3rd was Rosalie Ferrante's signed delivery receipt, showing the exact date and time, the name of the courier company, and a tracking number that led directly to a corporate account registered to Philip Tannehill's law office. 3 days later, the transfer proceedings were suspended. 7 days later, Harrogate Capital withdrew the order to clear and liquidate the contents of the house, accompanied by a 2-page letter explaining that the matter had resulted from a scheduling error involving a subcontractor. No one believed the letter, including the person who wrote it, but it still had to be written, because that was how companies like Harrogate stepped backward. At the Kent County Land Records Office, a silver-haired clerk pulled 3 files in response to a search request and placed them side by side on the counter. She compared the date the transfer filing had been recorded with the date printed on the work order. She read them again. She frowned longer than politeness normally allowed inside an administrative office, then stood, carried all 3 files into the back room, and didn't return for 20 minutes. She was the one who wrote the 3-line internal memorandum that later appeared on page 17 of the hearing record. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the middle of February, inside a conference room with windows overlooking the parking lot. No one shouted. The disciplinary board of the Bar Association sat on one side, Tannehill and his attorney sat on the other, and most of the time was spent reading document numbers aloud. What cost him his license wasn't the house in Warwick, nor was it the 2 men walking across wet grass at 11:40 on Friday night. What cost him his license were the 6 lines he himself had ordered, typed, and sent by signed courier to a party in an active dispute, offering to exchange the withdrawal of a motion for a promise concerning that person's administrative record. His attorney argued that, because the letter had no signature, individual responsibility couldn't be assigned. The board asked about the tracking number. The hearing ended at 11:20. Bud Mahoney and Lenny Poag weren't arrested. Their names appeared in the subcontractor assignment sheet attached to the case file, then again in June's sworn statement, and again in the interview record taken at the Warwick police station, along with a video lasting 1 minute and 19 seconds recorded from the front steps of the house. They became 2 names attached to dates, preserved in a file that anyone considering hiring them in the future could uncover. It wasn't justice in the form people usually imagined, but it did exactly what it needed to do. It turned 2 shadows at the edge of a woman's life into 2 written lines inside a paper folder. June received the news by telephone on Friday afternoon. Omar Najjar called, his voice as calm as always, and he spoke 3 sentences about procedure before giving her the 4th. He told her she could enter her home whenever she wished. She stood in the 3rd-floor kitchen with the telephone pressed to her ear, and she hadn't cried through that entire autumn. She hadn't cried at her mother's funeral, hadn't cried in the parking lot behind the fish market, hadn't cried on the night she walked toward the main road with a dog who refused to go any farther. She cried there, standing with one hand gripping the edge of the table, and when Rosalie heard her from the stairs, she stopped halfway up and remained there until the sound softened, then continued climbing as though she had only just arrived. They returned to Warwick on Saturday morning. Raphael opened the front door with June's key, pushed it inward, and stepped back to let her enter first. The house was dark and cold, and carried the smell of a place that had been closed since April. Wood, dust, and fabric draped over furniture. June walked inside alone. She crossed the living room, where the stacks of papers from those 2 nights still rested on the floor. She went into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and let the water run until the rust color cleared. She climbed to the 2nd floor, stood in the doorway of the small room, then came back downstairs. From her canvas bag, she removed the old summer photograph, 3 people on the porch and a young dog, and hung it again on the old nail in the living room wall, the nail that had remained there for 8 months because no one had thought to pull it out. She straightened the frame. Then she stepped back and looked at it. Sarge, however, didn't enter the house. He climbed the 2 front steps, crossed through the open doorway, stopped at the threshold leading back to the porch, and turned outside again. He walked to the right corner of the porch, to the place where a faint hollow marked the wooden floor, a mark whose meaning only someone who had lived there would understand, and he began to lie down, his front legs folded first, carefully, then his hindquarters lowered little by little, trembling once halfway down, stopping, then settling the rest of the way. He placed his chin on his front paws and turned his head toward the road. June came to the doorway and called him inside. He lifted his eyes toward her, moved his tail once, and didn't rise. She called again. Raphael rested one hand against the doorframe. "Let him stay there," he said. The first thing Raphael repaired was the broken step. He bought lumber from a building supply store on Post Road, brought home 2 long pine boards, and measured them wrong 3 times. The first time, he measured 1 centimeter too short. The second time, the measurement was correct, but his cut went crooked. The third time, June came out and sat on the top step with a cup of coffee. and told him that if he kept measuring with one eye narrowed like that, the porch still wouldn't be finished by summer. He didn't answer. He only rolled his sleeves a little higher, tucked the pencil behind his ear, and started again from the beginning. The step was finished on Saturday afternoon, and he stood on it and tested it 3 times before allowing her to walk across it. Then came the railing. The can of blue paint was still in the shed, its lid rusted and the paint inside covered with a thick skin. June pried the lid open and stirred it with a wooden stick for 20 minutes. And when the old blue appeared exactly as she remembered it, she sat on the shed floor for a while. Then she carried it out to the porch, began painting from the exact place where her mother had stopped, and finished the entire railing in one afternoon. The house opened at the end of March. June didn't sell it. She added more beds upstairs, repaired the water heater, hung curtains that blocked the daylight in the 2 east-facing rooms, and rented rooms by the week to workers from the seafood packing plants for less than anywhere else in the area. She offered them to people who worked the night shift, people who came home at 7 in the morning and needed to sleep while the rest of the world was awake. People like her mother had been for more than 20 years. The 2 rooms at the end of the hallway she kept empty in a different way. Every month, those rooms were available free of charge to women who needed somewhere to stay for a few weeks, with doors that locked from the inside, no questions about why they had come, and no demand that they tell their stories. She didn't advertise it anywhere. People learned through one another, the way such things had always been passed along. Sarge lived there for 3 months. He spent nearly every day lying on the porch, in the right corner where the wooden floor held a faint hollow, and the night shift tenants became accustomed to stepping around him at 7 in the morning and bending down to touch his good ear. He still pushed chairs into place. In the Warwick kitchen, one chair had a leg shorter than the other 3, and every morning the old dog walked inside, nudged it 3 times with his nose, pushed it back into line, and only then went to eat. At the beginning of April, he refused his breakfast. June said it was probably the change in the weather. At noon, he still wouldn't eat. That afternoon, she broke his food into small pieces, soaked it in warm water, and fed him from her hand, and he ate 2 bites for her, then stopped. The veterinarian came to the house the following morning, examined him for 15 minutes, and said the one thing June had already known before he opened his medical bag. There was nothing to treat. He was simply an 11-year-old dog who had reached the end of his road. He died on Tuesday afternoon on the living room floor, lying on the wool blanket Rosalie had given them on that first night at Federal Hill. June sat on the floor with her back against the leg of a chair and his head resting in her lap. Raphael sat on the other side, one hand resting on the dog's back, not stroking him, only holding it there. Outside, April sunlight fell at an angle through the newly painted railing. The dog's breathing gradually slowed, steady and unhurried, in and out, the same rhythm with which, on another night, he had sat beside a man who couldn't breathe. June bent down, pressed her forehead against his head, and whispered into his silvered ear, "It's all right. You've finished your work." His breathing continued for a little longer. Then it stopped, so gently that both of them waited several more seconds before they believed it. They buried him in the backyard, directly beneath the right corner of the porch where he had always lain. Raphael dug the grave. He wouldn't allow anyone to do it for him. June planted a hydrangea bush above him, bought from the plant shop at the end of the street, a variety that bloomed late, and she placed no marker there, because everyone who lived in that house would eventually understand what that place was. At the end of the month, June invited someone to visit. Poppy arrived on a bright Saturday morning with her aunt, and the 2 of them stood at the gate for a moment before entering the yard. She was 8 years old now and much taller, and she ran straight up the porch across the new step, stopped, turned around, and asked why that step looked newer than the others. June told her it had broken, and someone had repaired it. Inside, Poppy saw the photograph hanging on the living room wall and asked where the dog in the picture was. June knelt until they were eye to eye, beside Poppy's aunt, and told her that Sarge had lived there until that very spring, that he had grown very old and had gone into a long sleep, and that he was resting in his favorite place beside the porch. Then she told her about the chair. She told her how every morning the dog had walked into the kitchen and nudged the crooked chair 3 times with his nose until it stood in line again, and how, if someone deliberately pulled it farther out, he would abandon his breakfast to push it back. Poppy laughed aloud, laughing so hard that she dropped onto the kitchen floor, and she made June tell the story again. At noon, her aunt made lemonade. The 3 of them sat on the porch eating cake, and Poppy took a box of crayons from her bag and began to draw. She drew a house with a porch, a blue railing, and a slate-gray, wrinkled dog almost as large as the house lying in the right corner. She gave it to June and said it was for the refrigerator. June attached it to the refrigerator with 2 magnets, and it remained there for a very long time. Raphael didn't leave his world behind. That never happened, and both of them were grown enough not to pretend that it would. He still ate dinner at table number 4, still received telephone calls he answered in 6 words, and remained the man before whom the entire city lowered its head when he passed. What he changed was that he no longer brought that world near June. It stopped at the end of Sherwood Street, where he parked his car, and came no farther. He went down to Warwick during the day, repaired the upstairs window that had become stuck, replaced the pipe beneath the sink, and drove her to buy lumber. There were nights when he wasn't there, and he didn't tell her where he had gone, and June didn't ask. She knew exactly who stood beside her. She chose him with her eyes open, without illusions and without lying to herself. And perhaps that was why the thing she chose was able to endure. What remained after everything, the thing that kept returning, was the 3 small words at the bottom of the cardboard sign that day. Not the first 2 words, not the announcement. The final 3, written much smaller, crowded along the lower edge by the hand of someone who had run out of space and nearly run out of strength. Please. A woman who hadn't eaten for 2 days, who had no home, no work, and nothing left in her hands. And the only thing she could still think about was finding somewhere warm for her brother's old dog. Human dignity isn't measured by how much we possess. It is measured by what we still preserve for someone weaker than ourselves when our hands are empty. And kindness rarely arrives in the form we expect. Sometimes it comes from a hand that has done things it should never have done, a hand that isn't clean, but that, on one November afternoon, chose to stop instead of continuing on. No one was saved by a miracle. They were saved by one broken step being repaired, then by one railing being finished, then by one room being kept empty for a stranger. One act at a time, slowly, until a house became a place where people could live again. Now, on the porch of the house on Sherwood Street, there is an empty space in the right corner where the wooden floor dips slightly, and people still step around it out of habit. If this story touched something inside your heart, please press the like button, share it with someone you believe may need to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so more stories like this can find their way to you each day. How did the story of June, Raphael, and the old dog named Sarge make you feel? What part of this story reminded you of someone, a home, or a memory of your own? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.